This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Uteli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. Cross-strait tensions set to rise after Taiwan plans to simulate a potential Chinese invasion in 2027 at this year's War Games, while also seeking deeper military cooperation with the US. As South Korea is gearing up for President Yoon's impeachment ruling with 14,000 riot police on standby, up from 12,000, to tackle any surprise security threats. Now, Chinese internet and gaming giant Tencent says that profits in the fourth quarter of 2024 surged 90% on year, driven by its push into artificial intelligence. And Israel vows its renewed Gaza offensive is just the start, warning that any future talks with Hamas will happen under fire. Plus, Russia and Ukraine trade blame for fresh strikes just hours after President Putin told President Trump he would agree to pause attacks on energy infrastructure. Also on East Asia Tonight, developers and local governments in Asia's biggest economy turn to innovative strategies to sell more homes in part 2 of our in-depth examination of China's housing crisis. Taiwan says that its troops will carry out military drills to simulate a future Chinese invasion as Beijing maintains military pressure on the island. The remark comes ahead of Taiwan's annual Han Kuang drills aimed at defending the island against Chinese attacks. This year, the exercise will take place from the 9th to 18th of July. Defense officials submitted a report to Parliament today saying that the plan will be based on what's called China's gray zone intrusions and a possible invasion in 2027. Now, the goal is to verify the ability of troops that can maintain combat readiness. The U.S. previously pointed to 2027 as a possible year for a Chinese attack. Taiwan earlier this week released footage of Chinese military exercises near the island. Officials say more than 50 Chinese aircraft took part in joint combat patrols flying around Taiwan. Just days ago, the island's leader, William Lai, called Beijing a hostile force. Beijing's foreign ministry says the patrols were in response to U.S. support for Taiwan and serve as a warning to what they call separatist forces. China claims Taiwan is part of its territory and is vowed to take control by force if necessary. Now, CNA's Victoria Jen, she joins us now from Taipei. Vic, now today's announcement follows a report that Taiwan is also seeking closer military ties with the U.S. But help us understand this. Isn't Taipei seeking to be less reliant on Washington?
That's right. There has been growing concerns among many Taiwanese that whether or not the U.S. will continue to support Taiwan the way that it has always been. And this comes especially after the recent fallout between Ukrainian President Zelenskyy and U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, the incident has raised concerns among many Taiwanese that whether or not the U.S. would come to Taiwan's aid if the war was to break out between Taiwan and China. Now, in fact, a recent survey shows that more than 50% of Taiwanese, they don't believe that the U.S. would come to Taiwan's rescue if a war breaks out across the Taiwan Strait. Now, so many are urging the DPP government not to pull all eggs in the U.S. basket. But having said that, the DPP government still insisted that it is important for Taiwan to continue its military cooperations with the U.S., especially it's going to further deepen its cooperation. Now, this comes especially after China has increased its military activities around the island, and not to mention the daily military incursions of warplanes and vessels by China. So in order to secure U.S. support for Taiwan, President William Lai has pledged to increase Taiwan's military spending to more than 3% of Taiwan's GDP. That is a record from the current 2.5%, even though it's still much lower than what the Trump has asked for, which is 10%. But it goes to show that that Taiwan is trying its best to try to comply with the U.S. demand. So, but analysts are saying that they are worried this is going to further provoke China and it's going to further complicate the matters for future cross-strait relations.
Many thanks for that report, Victoria Jen, speaking to us live from Taipei. Now, South Korea and the U.S. are wrapping up their large annual joint military drills. The 11-day Freedom Shield exercise brought together thousands of troops to test military readiness against North Korea. Well, the drills will end tomorrow. This year, a total of 16 brigade-level field trainings took place, up from 10 such drills last year. Freedom Shield was the first major exercise between Seoul and Washington since President Trump returned to office. Concerns had been mounting in South Korea that Mr. Trump might scale back military drills with Seoul after the president complained about the cost of bilateral exercises. During his first term, Donald Trump unilaterally cancelled a drill after his summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. North Korea has long blasted the allies' joint exercises as rehearsing for an invasion. South Korean police are stepping up their deployment plans for when the Constitutional Court delivers its ruling on President Yoon's impeachment. Although the court has not set a date just yet, a verdict is expected soon. About 14,000 riot police officers will be mobilized to better cope with unexpected security situations on that day. Tensions have been running high since President Yoon briefly imposed martial law last December. When Mr. Yoon was arrested in January, his supporters charged into Seoul's Western District Court to protest. He was later released. With a looming verdict, authorities are once again bracing for possible social unrest. Police have been preparing for the risk of clashes as both Yoon's supporters and his opponents are due to hold large rallies. Security has also been stepped up to protect the court, judges and opposition figures. In Japan, an unseasonal snow spell is making a comeback at a time where the country should usually be ushering in spring. Authorities are issuing severe weather warnings against possible tornadoes, hail, and heavy rain in the coming days. Well, heavy snowfall swept across the archipelago in the early morning, with the worst-hit Tottori prefecture seeing nearly 200 centimeters of snow. Capital Tokyo also woke up to the cold weather that is expected to persist until tomorrow. Unstable atmospheric conditions will continue to send temperatures lower as cold winds intensify. Japan's Met Agency has warned of icy roads and traffic disruptions. Several trains have also been cancelled as a precaution. Well, the out-of-season cold conditions come just days before the country's highly anticipated cherry blossom season. Flowers are expected to start blooming in Tokyo as early as Saturday. A United Nations report says that hundreds of thousands of people were forced to flee natural disasters in 2024, citing record numbers from the International Displacement Monitoring Center. Well, the World Meteorological Organization adds that last year is also the warmest year on record. Poorer countries were found to be severely affected by these calamities, but wealthy nations were also not spared. Well, floods in Valencia, Spain, and the wildfires in California's Hollywood region also resulted in massive evacuations. Well, UN Chief Antonio Guterres says that the planet is issuing more distress signals. Carbon dioxide concentration are close to doubling pre-industrial levels, and global mean near-surface temperatures rising 1.55 degrees Celsius, exceeding the Paris Agreement goals. And this is only one part of the picture. Experts say that warming of water bodies and the melting of frozen parts of our world are continuing at an alarming rate, with the Antarctic sea ice reaching its second lowest extent recorded. Well, the report underscores the urgent need for action to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, especially strengthening areas like early warning systems, climate resilience, and cutting emissions. I'm going to go for a break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, South Korean tech giant Samsung apologizes to shareholders after a year of weak performance, promises deals to revive growth. Plus,
I'm Tan Zihui in San Jose, California, and I'll explain to you just what Silicon Valley tech giant NVIDIA is rolling out to stay out in front of the AI race.
hello again. Up next, we've got business news with Roland Lim. Now, Roland, I believe there's a sharp turnaround for China's Tencent after years of subdued growth.
You heard right, Oteli. The Chinese internet and gaming giant posted its best revenue growth in more than a year. And that further boosts investor confidence in the tech giant, as well as AI in particular. Tencent nearly doubled its profit in the final quarter of 2024 as the firm accelerated a push into artificial intelligence while continuing to build on its gaming momentum. Net profit surged 90% on year to $6.6 billion, while revenue rose 11% from a year ago to around $24 billion. Now, both figures handily beating market estimates. The growth was supported by solid games and advertising revenue, which offset the fintech weakness. Its domestic game division delivered a 23% sales gain, while advertising revenue rose 17%. It is the company's fastest pace of revenue growth in more than a year. The company has also benefited from regulatory easing in China's gaming sector following the stringent restrictions of previous years. Tencent has also invested heavily in AI for years and developed its own large language model. Experts say its recent adoption of homegrown DeepSeek's low-cost model could translate to more monetization opportunities. Japan's central bank has held interest rates steady as policymakers assess how U.S. trade decisions could impact the economy. The decision keeps the policy rate at 0.5%. Officials began lifting borrowing costs last year after nearly 2 decades of ultra-loose policy. But the Bank of Japan's governor, Kazuo Ueda, says that further increases could come.
先行きの経済物価金融情勢次第ですが、現在の実質金利が極めて低い水準にあることを踏まえますと、以上のような経済物価見通しが実現していくとすれば、それに応じて引き続き政策金利を引き上げ、金融緩和度合いを調整していくことになると考えています。
The central bank governor also saying the uncertainty brought on by U.S. tariffs remain high, acknowledging that they could not just directly affect the economy and inflation, but also influence market sentiment and business confidence. Now, inflation is a concern with rising food prices, including rice, pushing up costs. He also warned that inflation risks increase. The Bank of Japan may need to speed up its policy adjustments. Wage hikes are also in focus, with pay raises extending beyond large firms. But the BOJ is watching whether this translates into sustainable inflation. Markets reacted cautiously to the news. The yen is currently weaker against the greenback by 0.34%, just under that 145 level to the dollar, while the Nikkei 225 ending the day in the red. Mio Kato, founder of Lightstream Research, explains the key factors influencing the BOJ's rate decision and how global interest rate trends could shape its next moves.
I think the trade outlook is one thing, and the overall inflation and wage spiral is the counterbalancing factor. So the BOJ in its meeting notes did highlight the fact that they were concerned about some of the trade-related risks, and that is probably also tied into some of the concerns about a potential US recession in future. On the other side, there is a lot of pressure on them to continue raising rates simply because inflation here has not really subsided. Rice prices in particular have been very high, and that's been putting a lot of pressure on consumers. And so they're faced with a very difficult tightrope to walk because on the consumer side, there's a serious need to reduce inflation. but then there are also risks from the global macroeconomic side. And in addition to that, if they do raise rates too quickly and it becomes disorderly, then that would also pressure government finances simply because of Japan's large debt. So one thing to consider is whether the overall global inflation outlook actually continues to ease, as appears to be happening in certain countries. We're not entirely convinced that this is going to be a long-term thing. So the BOJ does need to be domestically focused, but there's also the fact that they need to be aware of the interest rate differential between Japan and particularly the US, but also the rest of the world. So if inflation picks up in the US again and there is no reduction in US interest rates or even an increase, that makes it a lot easier for the BOJ to also continue raising. But the outside factors also will impact the BOJ's decisions because they do have to take into account trade as well as the overall economic impact if the US does slow down.
Staying in Japan, a solid debut for shares of Japanese semiconductor material supplier JX Advanced Metals on its debut on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Shares of the 120-year-old company closed up 874 yen as compared to its IPO price of 820, and that's 6.6% higher for the day. It did climb as high as 7.7% in intraday trade. Investors pick up the stock for its exposure to AI as well as computing trends. The company has raised some $3 billion in what is the country's largest IPO in almost 7 years, topping Tokyo Metro's $2.3 billion in October. The listing comes amid a shaky time for semiconductor tech and AI stocks, which have faced massive sell-offs in recent weeks as investors remain skittish over the threats of tariffs by US President Trump. But some investors are optimistic, saying that the falling share prices are a buying opportunity. China is reported delaying approval for EV maker BYD's plans to build a plant in Mexico. That's amid fears for a cross-border tech leak to the US. It is the second setback the company is facing in the Americas, as Brazilian authorities halted construction of its factory in December over, quote, slavery-like conditions. Sources say that authorities in Beijing are afraid that Mexico's proximity to the US will give the US access to BYD's technology, and shifting geopolitical priorities have caused Mexico to take a hostile attitude towards Chinese companies as the country seeks to maintain good relations with its northern neighbor. The Chinese EV giant had announced plans to expand production overseas back in 2023, but in a recent interview with the Financial Times, its executive vice president, Stella Lee, says the company has not decided on the Mexico plant yet. Shares of the EV maker, however, has reached all-time high in today's trade as the company unveiled breakthrough technology that charges its batteries in about 5 minutes flat. That's about the same time it takes to refuel a petrol car. Taiwanese firms are ramping up their expansion into the US, shifting manufacturing operations across the Pacific. The trend has gained momentum in recent years, fueled by rising tariffs and trade barriers under US President Trump's policies. One of the most notable moves coming from TSMC, which announced a $100 billion investment in the US this month. The commitment highlights Taiwan's growing role in American tech production. Alongside TSMC, Foxconn, that's a key supplier for Apple, is also expanding its operations, including a new AI server assembly site in Texas. Foxconn is also in talks to boost its presence in Pennsylvania and Texas, aligning with its major customers like Apple and Nvidia. Smaller Taiwanese firms are also making similar moves. Tech companies from Apple to Meta have been stepping up their US investments, driven by the impact of Mr. Trump's policies. However, Taiwan is watching these shifts with caution. Now, the island has long been at the heart of the global tech supply chain, and there are concerns that too many factories moving abroad could undermine Taiwan's strategic role. Over on Wall Street, Nvidia was the worst performer on the Dow overnight, even as the AI market leader unveiled its newest set of chips to power AI intelligence systems for customers like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Meta. CEO Jensen Huang said its newest Blackwell Ultra chips will be able to build more content at a faster rate than its predecessor. It's also expected to give NVIDIA a 50-fold increase in data center revenue opportunities. Mr. Huang also previewed its next-generation chips, including the Vera Rubin, which will be launched next year, and the Feynman chips arriving in 2028. NVIDIA also announced a strategic collaboration with General Motors that would see the automaker use NVIDIA's AI chips to develop autonomous vehicle technology for its cars. CNA's Tan Se-Hui reports from San Jose, California.
It's said to be the Super Bowl of AI, with 25,000 attendees at the conference and around 300,000 tuning in virtually from around the world.
Blackwell.
NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang unveiled the company's next-generation line of chips, Blackwell Ultra, that's set to ship in the second half of this year, as well as Vera Rubin in 2026. Also introduced the next super chip after Vera Rubin, called Rubin Ultra, which will be shipped in 2027. All these are set to boast higher speeds and memory bandwidth, allowing it to support larger AI models.
We're building AI factories and AI infrastructure. It's going to take years of planning. This isn't like buying a laptop. You know, this isn't discretionary spend. This is spend that we have to go plan on. And so we have to plan on having, of course, the land and the power, and we have to get our CapEx ready, and we get engineering teams, and we have to lay it out a couple, 2-3 years in advance, which is the reason why I show you our roadmap a couple, 2-3 years in advance.
Other product launches include a new line of personal AI computers called DGX Spark, as well as the debut of Groot, a foundation model for AI robotics.
Look how smart you are. Yes, you're smart.
The highly celebrated conference offers a peek into the future. It's also a platform for NVIDIA to reassure investors of its leadership in the fast-evolving AI scene. The company's stock price has been hit by fears that future demand for AI chips may not meet expectations following the entry of Chinese startup DeepSeek, which claims its AI models were developed with a fraction of the chips and at a significantly lower cost. It isn't helping either that U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening a 25% tariff on semiconductors produced overseas, with the potential for further export controls. But the tech rout on NASDAQ hasn't dampened the mood at this year's GTC.
The growth of the AI in many fields. We are working in manufacturing, so we see the uptake there is incredible, and the Gen AI is introducing so many new possibilities.
Agentic AI I see as a force to reckon with, because now you have a system in which you can distribute the workloads from narrow models and get more accurate results. So I'm very optimistic about that.
Last month, AI chips lifted the company's total revenue by 78% from a year earlier to $39.3 billion during the 3 months that ended in January. The GTC conference runs till March 21st. An entire day will be set aside for quantum technology on Thursday. Tan Se-Hui, CNA, San Jose.
While NVIDIA has successfully capitalized on the AI boom, shareholders of Samsung Electronics have slammed management for their failure to tap into the industry. Samsung's CEO, Han Jong-hee, apologized for the recent stock performance at the company's annual general meeting. Mr. Han says that Samsung is now looking at major deals to drive growth, but has flagged uncertainties around economic policies in major economies and has cautioned that 2025 will be a difficult year. The CEO also says that the firm will be flexible in responding to Trump's tariffs.
기존 사업은 초격차 기술 리더십으로 재도약의 기틀을 다지고 AI 산업 성장이 만들어가는 미래에 새로운 성장 동력을 확보할 수 있도록 로봇, 메드텍, 차세대 반도체 등의 영역에서 새로운 도전을 이어가겠습니다.
Samsung shares ending the day higher on the CEO's action plan to boost growth, but its share price in the last 12 months still in the doldrums. It's one of the worst performing tech stocks last year. And that'll do it for Business News. Oteli, back to you.
Thanks so very much for that, Roland. We're going to go for another break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, Israel says its resumption of strikes on Gaza is only the beginning and that future negotiations with Hamas will only take place under fire. Russia and Ukraine trade blame for fresh strikes hours after President Putin told President Trump he would agree to pause attacks on energy infrastructure. This is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Taiwan will simulate possible scenarios for a Chinese invasion in 2027 during the island's war games this year, amid continued military pressure from Beijing. South Korean police step up their deployment plans, mobilizing 14,000 riot police as the country braces for a constitutional court verdict on President Yoon's impeachment. Tencent's push into artificial intelligence and its gaming momentum has nearly doubled its profits in the final quarter of 2024. Net profits surged 90% on year to more than $6 billion. Gaza civil defense officials say at least 13 people in the north and south have been killed in Israeli airstrikes overnight. It comes just a day after Israel renewed its bombardment on the enclave since January's ceasefire deal. Now, the resumption of Israeli attacks has sparked international condemnation. EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, says that she told Israel's foreign minister that the situation in Gaza is unacceptable. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock says that the raids are, quote, shattering the tangible hopes on all sides, and urged warring parties to show restraint. Now, China says that violence is not the right way to resolve the hostage crisis or issue.
反而可能给他们带去更多的危险。中方敦促以色列放弃使用武力的执念，立即停止对加沙的军事行动。 停止对加沙平民的集体惩罚。我们强烈要求实现加沙持久停火。
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Tuesday's attacks that killed more than 400 Palestinians were only the beginning, and that fighting will not stop until, quote, vital goals are achieved. The Israeli leader said that the attack against Hamas was due to its refusal to release more hostages. Hamas says it has not shut the door on talks, but insisted that there is no need for new agreements. The group now wants Israel to be forced to implement the ceasefire. It also accused Israel of putting the fate of some 59 Israeli captives in jeopardy. On the ground, residents in 4 areas of Gaza have been ordered by Israeli forces to evacuate from combat zones and to move to shelters in western Gaza City and Khan Yunis for their own safety. Israel's attacks in Gaza have shattered the 2-month ceasefire with Hamas, with plans to gradually ramp up its military operations in Gaza, which may include a renewed ground invasion. Teresa Tang has more on the events that got us here.
The ceasefire, which took effect in January, largely halted the war, which was triggered on the 7th of October 2023, when Hamas stormed southern Israel. Israel retaliated with airstrikes on Gaza and later, within the same month, launched a ground offensive. On the 21st of November, both sides agreed to a 7-day truce, releasing around half the hostages. But the war quickly resumed on the 1st of December, and progress towards peace has since stalled. Only about half a year later, there was the first sign of a possible ceasefire. Hamas accepted a proposal by Egypt, Qatar, and the U.S., but Israel did not agree to the text and launched an attack on Rafah. And after more than a year of conflict, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, former defense chief Yoav Gallant, as well as Hamas's Ibrahim Masir for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. More violence and strikes continued until the 15th of January of this year. That's when negotiators finally reached a deal for a ceasefire after 15 months of conflict. It included a phased agreement, which saw hostage and prisoner releases, but delayed talks on Gaza's future. The ceasefire took effect 4 days later, and Hamas frees the first batch of hostages. But peace in Gaza was shaky, with both sides unable to agree on the next steps. Hamas has demanded negotiations for a second phase, threatening to hold off hostage releases, while Israel had sought to extend the first phase, cutting off aid and electricity to Gaza over the deadlock. Now, Israel has resumed intense airstrikes on Gaza in a bid to use force to free the remaining hostages.
Singapore's Foreign Affairs Ministry has expressed grave concern about the resumption of hostilities in Gaza, which has resulted in escalating civilian casualties. A ministry spokesperson says that all civilians must be protected according to international humanitarian law and that all hostages must be released immediately. MFA adds that the delivery of humanitarian supplies to Gaza should not be impeded, urging all parties to resume negotiations towards a permanent ceasefire. Prime Minister Lawrence Wong also said in a Facebook post late last night that Singapore has been steadfast in supporting the urgent needs of Gaza. For instance, by providing capacity-building programs to support Palestinians in eventually governing their own state and other ground-up initiatives. Mr. Wong attended the briefing for one such program aimed at helping Palestinian students pursue university education in Singapore. Called the Palestinian Scholarship Initiative, it will sponsor tuition, lodging, and other related expenses for 2 students. Over 150 have since applied, with over half coming from Gaza. PM Wong said that, be it through ground-up initiatives or government programs, Singapore will continue to do whatever it can to support the people of Palestine in their time of need. And we have more on this story on our website, cna.asia, including this article where Singapore urged the resumption of truce negotiations, saying it is gravely concerned by the resurging hostilities. And you may also follow the latest on our mobile app. Earlier, Asia First spoke to Jonathan Penikoff, a director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, and he began by explaining what pushed Israel to resume the war.
I think that's the question a lot of Israelis are asking. I think there's 2 challenges here. One is clearly Prime Minister Netanyahu is under a significant amount of political pressure in order to keep the coalition together, in order to keep power. The reality was ultranationalists like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who rejoined the coalition, never wanted a ceasefire. The same is true with Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. But I think the bigger question really is, how is Israel going to move forward? At the end of the day, the big challenge is there's still no answer to security, to how Israel ends up having a secure border or how there's security in Gaza for the Palestinian people. And with Hamas being able to remain in power, that was never going to be an option. And so I think the Israelis wanted to try and have a slightly different ceasefire, a ceasefire that would have more hostages released. Obviously, that was going to reduce Hamas's really single point of leverage, and so they were not going to agree to it. They wanted to move on to phase 2 of the original ceasefire agreement of having all Israeli troops out. And so you got to a standstill, and that standstill, frankly, resulted in what was perhaps inevitable in the resumption, unfortunately, of this tragic war.
So, Jonathan, is the ceasefire truly over now, or is there still potential for it to be revived in any way?
Look, I'm as big an optimist as anybody. I would hope that it could be revived. I think it's pretty unlikely. I think in order for it to be revived quickly, you would need to see a new arrangement being made between Hamas and between Israel, and I just can't imagine that happening. The problem is the folks who are being negotiated with for Hamas in Doha are not always on the same page as the Hamas leadership in the Gaza Strip. We've seen this for a long time now, but even as you've seen a lot of the leadership be killed by the Israelis, it still continues to be true. And so now that the war has restarted, there's less incentive for Hamas and the Gaza Strip to be willing to say, yes, we'll make this brief and continue to have another ceasefire or reach another ceasefire. And I think for Israel, there's no great incentive. Originally, there was hope that maybe Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted to get through the budget in Israel, which would come end of this month, or maybe through the end of Ramadan, or maybe through the Passover holiday, which will happen mid next month. And none of that seemed to be the case. In the end, it seems to have been that the two sides just felt 2 months was enough. There weren't going to be more hostages released. And so I think we're at a point where the ceasefire really has collapsed.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has slammed Russia for demonstrating that it is not ready to put an end to the war. In a press conference with his Finnish counterpart, Alexander Stubb, Mr. Zelenskyy says he is set to talk to U.S. President Donald Trump later today, where he is expecting to hear about the details of Mr. Trump's call with Russian leader Vladimir Putin. He added that Kyiv is ready to send a team for further discussions with the U.S. on a ceasefire. But the Ukrainian leader says that they will not recognize occupied territories as Russian, calling it a red line. Mr. Stubb has expressed Finland's firm support for Kyiv, reiterating the need for Europe to increase its efforts to strengthen Ukraine and put pressure on Russia to come to the negotiating table. A European Union foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, has accused President Putin of being unwilling to make concessions to achieve a truce after the Russian leader refused an American-backed 30-day ceasefire proposal during his call with Mr. Trump, unless the West halts all military aid for Kyiv. Ms. Kallas argued that Moscow does not really want peace and that Russia is merely seizing the opportunity to present their demands that are ultimate goals and cannot be trusted. But Moscow has also hit back at Kyiv, accusing Ukraine of attacking an oil depot in southern Russia in attempts to derail agreements reached between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump. Meanwhile, China has welcomed the steps towards a truce in Ukraine following Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin's call.
我们注意到有关报道，中方从一开始就主张通过对话谈判解决危机，乐见一切通往停火的努力，认为这是实现和平的必要一步。
Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, what Chinese officials and developers are doing to sell more homes amid a property crisis in Asia's biggest economy in the second episode of our three-part special on China's housing market. Plus,
and splashdown, Crew 9 back on Earth.
NASA astronauts Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore touched down on Earth after an 8-day space mission turned into a 9-month stay. China is currently grappling with a prolonged housing crisis of unprecedented scale that's having a knock-on effect on Asia's largest economy. In the second installment of our three-part special, CNA's Lauren Ong takes a look at marketing strategies by local governments and developers in their efforts to sell more homes.
In her 60s, retiree Zhang Xiaoying is cruising through life, literally, as she shows off her rollerblading skills. Well, it's just been a few months since she first picked up the sport. Madam Zhang is now a regular at this park in Wuxi, a city just west of Shanghai.
我们呢没有上海啊、北京啊那么人那么多，比较那个叫我们说起来比较休闲的那种，不会是很忙啊，像我们老年人啊，到一定年纪就基本上休闲了，完了。
This relatively carefree lifestyle is a key selling point touted by real estate firms in Wuxi, which are looking to entice homebuyers from neighboring regions. Since last October, an expanded housing trading scheme has allowed residents in nearby cities to swap their old flats for new ones in Wuxi. This includes those from the higher-tiered city of Shanghai.
This is one of the two new developments that participants can trade in their houses for. Located at the so-called luxury residential community, there's a hospital, schools and malls just a kilometer away. But more interestingly, it's built in a technology park, earmarked for a science and technology hub. It's close to startups in industries like biopharmaceuticals, new energy and advanced manufacturing. Plus, it's just a half-hour's drive to the Wuxi Economic Development Zone.
Housing trading schemes are not new. They've emerged as a solution to clear inventory after a housing crisis dating back to 2021 saw developers go bust and market confidence shaken. But Wuxi is the first to take it across cities, following moves by China to allow local government authorities to craft their own incentive plans in September.
我们目前从以旧换新这个活动开展以来，截止到目前的话，我们整体参与这个以旧换新的以无锡本地为主，可能占到60%、70%左右啊，都是无锡。比如说我们这个无锡的市区或者是江阴、宜兴啊，然后可能有20%到30%呢是我们长三角周边城市的意向 置换群体啊，比如说南京啊、上海，对吧？苏州，对吧？常州等等。
Depending on the conditions of their current property, homeowners can exchange it for one or multiple new flats, or trade in several for just one.
刚好借着这个以旧换新的东风，刚好是达到一个置换的目的，也就是他在无锡买房子，本身是有这方面的一个居住需求的。可能他的旧房的房龄比较老，可能他有的是楼梯房没有电梯啊，房龄可能有到20年、30年、40年，甚至是更久。可能他这一部分老房子呢比较老旧。
这个是无锡的电视台的信号塔。
Local state media have hailed it as a pioneering initiative, paving the way for others to follow, including cities vying for home buyers seeking an upgrade. In their desperation to tide through the housing crisis and win over home buyers, local governments are breaking not just geographical barriers. Take Nanning, the capital of Guangxi province in South China and a Tier 2 city with a population of about 8 million. Developers are reaching out to buyers from as far as China's northeast. Others have bundled potential job offers with home purchases or offering perks like a decade of free metro rides.
Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities are in fact already in a competition of attracting, in particular, young generation, or more specifically, talents, people who have purchasing power, who will become the demand of the housing market. Because all these local governments need labor force, need young population. Okay, not only to buy the housing, but also to contribute to GDP, to contribute to tax revenue.
In Wuxi, some residents embrace the prospect of a growing community.
置换的时候，如果把旧房子可以换的话，可以省一笔资金嘛，这样子更方便换新的。然后人也需要不断的就是提高自己嘛，提高自己环境嘛。不同城市的人都可以交往嘛，来。
还主要那个生活的节奏没有上海那样紧张嘛。现在无锡嘛，生活也比较轻松了，没有这么压力大。
While the long-term impacts of these creative measures on the economy or demography are still unclear, some are getting ahead of the curve, relocating in search of a better life and more affordable housing. Lauren Ong, CNA, Wuxi.
NASA officials have praised the resilience of a pair of astronauts who had been stranded in space for 9 months. It follows the return of those Crew 9 members, Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore.
You know, the thing I think back of this whole time frame is how really resilient Butch and Sunny were the whole time. I mean, they launched on what was going to be a short test flight with the crew flight test vehicle with Boeing. And then they moved very quickly into station increment operations, and they became seamlessly part of the International Space Station. And they did that because they're experienced astronauts.
And splashdown, Crew 9 back on Earth.
That was nothing short of a hero's welcome for the 2 NASA astronauts, as watch parties eagerly awaited the return of the SpaceX capsule. Williams and Wilmore, along with 2 other Crew 9 members, splashed down off the coast of Tallahassee, Florida, just before 6 a.m. Singapore-Hong Kong time. Well, the journey back to Earth took 17 hours from the time the SpaceX Dragon Freedom spacecraft undocked from the International Space Station. And this was the moment when Miss Williams exited the capsule, followed shortly by Mr. Wilmore. It is the first breath of fresh air for the pair since they departed for the ISS last year. So just how did they end up getting stuck in space? Julie Yu with more.
The Wilmore and Williams blasted off in a Boeing Starliner last June, heading to the International Space Station. They were supposed to be back in just over a week, but things didn't go as planned. During their 24-hour journey to the ISS, 5 of the spacecraft's 28 thrusters malfunctioned. A propellant valve also failed, and multiple helium leaks were reported. NASA eventually deemed the vehicle unsafe for crew, and the capsule returned to Earth in September last year without the 2 astronauts. Now, the current plan to bring the stranded space flyers home was then set into motion. A SpaceX mission called Crew 9 was launched that same month. It brought 2 astronauts to the ISS on board a Dragon spacecraft with 2 empty seats for Wilmore and Williams. But the long-awaited Crew 10 mission to swap out the astronauts was delayed in its final hour last week due to a hydraulic issue. It blasted off 2 days later, paving the way for Wilmore and Williams to return home. So what were the astronauts up to during their extended stay? Between them, they spent more than 900 hours working on more than 150 scientific experiments. Suni Williams also broke the record for the most spacewalk time by a woman, a staggering 62 hours and 6 minutes across all her missions. The NASA assures that despite the delay, their time in space posed no major risks, with the ISS resupplied with all the essentials like food, water, and oxygen. But NASA also flags potential risks to personal health of astronauts due to extended stay in space, from vision changes to bone density loss. And it says the radiation in space could potentially increase the risk of cancer and other degenerative disorders, though research into this is still ongoing. So with all these risks, why do we keep sending astronauts into space? Now, the answer lies in the unique environment of space. Microgravity offers scientists the chance to conduct groundbreaking research from how molecules react in space and how the human body adapts to spaceflight. An observation from orbit also provides a key source of data to track climate change and inform natural disaster responses.
And that wraps up Wednesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.